On the morning of January 18th, 1921, an undertaker named Charles Daly drove from Islip, New York, to the grounds of Idlehour, one of the largest private estates on Long Island. He was there to perform a task that should not have been necessary. 7.5 years earlier, a young man named Samuel Stephen Sands III had been laid to rest in a white marble mausoleum on the property. The mausoleum stood on 900 acres of carefully landscaped grounds that included a 110-room mansion, stables for 100 automobiles, and gardens that stretched to the Connequot River. Samuel had died in an automobile accident in 1913. He was 29 years old. His mother had buried him here because it was her home, or so she thought. But in 1920, the estate had passed to new ownership. Samuel's body would have to be moved. Daly and his assistants opened the mausoleum, removed the casket, and transported it to Fresh Pond Crematory in Queens. The body was cremated. An attorney named William H. Earl collected the ashes. Where they went after that, no one recorded. The location of Samuel Stephen Sands III's remains is unknown to this day. His mother's name was Anne Harriman Vanderbilt, and this moment marked the culmination of a pattern that had defined her life. She had married into two of America's greatest fortunes. She had lived in palaces and entertained presidents. She had transformed neighborhoods and financed housing for the poor. She had been widowed 3 times and buried 2 sons. But when the legal documents were signed and the properties changed hands, she discovered that access to wealth is not the same as ownership. What brought Anne to this moment, standing outside gates she no longer controlled while strangers removed her son's body from earth she could no longer claim, began 60 years earlier in a different New York entirely. Before we follow Anne's journey through 3 marriages, 2 family fortunes, and the property battles that would define her final years, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and if stories about Gilded Age New York and the families who shaped it fascinate you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's return to where it all began. Anne Harriman was born on February 17, 1861 in Manhattan, the daughter of a man who would leave a $20 million fortune and a house his widow would inherit, but his children would eventually lose. Her father was Oliver Harriman, born September 16, 1829, the son of Orlando Harriman and Anne England. Oliver's grandfather, William Harriman, had emigrated from England in 1795 and built a successful trading business that became the foundation for the family's wealth. Oliver followed the family pattern, but he would exceed his grandfather's achievements by an order of magnitude. He started his career in the dry goods commission house of McCurdy, Aldrich, and Spencer, working alongside the father of Richard A. McCurdy, who would later become president of the Mutual Life Insurance Company. The work was unglamorous but lucrative. Dry goods merchants in mid-19th century New York served as intermediaries between manufacturers and retailers, handling everything from fabrics to household goods. The margins were thin, but the volume was enormous. A successful firm could process hundreds of thousands of dollars in transactions annually. When the senior partners at McCurdy, Aldrich, and Spencer retired, Oliver saw an opportunity. He formed a partnership with James Lowe, an established merchant with capital and connections. The new firm, Lowe, Harriman and Company, would become one of the wealthiest dry goods houses in New York City. But Oliver did more than simply continue an existing business. He expanded into banking and finance, leveraging the cash flow from dry goods sales to fund other ventures. James Lowe was more than Oliver's business partner. He was also his father-in-law. Oliver married James Lowe's daughter, Laura, who was born in 1834. It was a marriage that united business and family interests in the way that elite New York families had perfected. Laura Lowe Harriman brought more than money to the marriage. She brought connections to other mercantile families, social standing, and the expectation that she would raise children who understood their position in society. Together, Oliver and Laura had 8 children, each born into a world of increasing wealth and expectation. Anne was the second daughter, born into a household that already included her older brother James Lowe Harriman, born in 1856, and her older sister Emmeline, born in 1860. Siblings would follow with clockwork regularity. Oliver Harriman Jr. arrived in 1862. Jefferson Borden Harriman, known as Borden, came in 1864. Joseph Harriman was born around 1865. Herbert Melville Harriman, the youngest son, arrived in 1873, a full 12 years after Anne. Her younger sister Lily, born in 1870, completed the family. The Harriman household operated on a scale that reflected Oliver's success. They maintained a residence in Manhattan for the social season and a substantial property in Riverdale in the Bronx, overlooking the Hudson River. The Riverdale estate would eventually become the source of considerable wealth in its own right. When it was subdivided and sold after Oliver's death, even small parcels commanded significant prices. But beyond his business success and real estate holdings, Oliver Harriman built influence through board positions. He served as a director of the Bank of America, one of the city's most important financial institutions. He sat on the board of the Guarantee Trust Company of New York, which would later merge with J.P. Morgan and Company to form Morgan Guaranty Trust. These were not ceremonial positions. Bank directors in the Gilded Age controlled access to capital, decided which ventures received financing, and shaped the direction of American commerce. Oliver's position gave him power that extended far beyond his own fortune. Anne grew up understanding that she belonged to two overlapping circles of American aristocracy. Her father's wealth came from commerce and banking, but her family's influence extended further through blood ties. Oliver's brother, Orlando Harriman, was the father of Edward Henry Harriman, who would become one of the most powerful railroad magnates in America. This meant Anne's first cousin was E. H. Harriman, the man who would control the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, and a railroad empire that stretched from coast to coast. E. H. Harriman's son would be W. Averill Harriman, who would serve as governor of New York, ambassador to the Soviet Union, and a pivotal figure in shaping American foreign policy during the Cold War. The Harriman name carried weight in banking, in railroads, in both New York society and national politics. This was the world Anne inherited. She learned from an early age that wealth brought responsibility, that social position required careful management, and that women of her class were expected to marry well, manage households, and engage in charitable work that demonstrated their family's civic commitment. Oliver Harriman died on March 12, 1904, at his estate in Mount Kisco, New York. He was 74 years old. His will revealed an estate worth $20 million, a fortune roughly equivalent to $600 million today. The document stipulated that his widow, Laura, would inherit their house in Riverdale along with an annual income of $500,000, an enormous sum that guaranteed she would live in comfort for the rest of her life. His sister, Rosamond H. Owen, received a bequest of $25,000, a generous but much smaller amount that reflected the primary obligation to his wife and children. But the estate itself would not remain intact. Like most fortunes of that era, it would be divided among heirs, invested in various ventures, and gradually dispersed. The Riverdale property was eventually sold in parcels. Records from one auction show that 98 lots brought $68,650, averaging about $700 per lot. Land that had been a unified estate became dozens of individual properties, each sold to buyers who would build their own houses and create their own lives on what had been Harriman ground. The pattern was repeated thousands of times across New York as the great estates of the mid-19th century were subdivided in the early 20th. The Harriman fortune, like the Vanderbilt fortune and the Astor fortune and all the others, would disperse across heirs and investments and real estate transactions until the name carried more weight than the bank accounts of any individual descendant. But in 1882, when Anne turned 21, the fortune was intact and the name was powerful. She was among the most eligible young women in New York, an heiress connected to banking wealth and railroad power. Raised in a household where servants managed daily operations, while she learned to play piano, speak French, and navigate the intricate social codes that governed her class. Within a year, she would be married to a man who understood her world perfectly, because he came from the same one. On April 11, 1882, Anne Harriman married Samuel Stephen Sands, Jr., in a ceremony that united two banking families who had known each other for decades. Samuel was born in 1856, the son of Samuel Stephen Sands, who had been born in 1827 and served as head of S.S. Sands and Company, one of the most respected banking houses in New York. The Sands family traced their presence in New York back through multiple generations. Samuel's grandfather, Austin Ledyard Sands, had been a merchant in the city during the early decades of the 19th century. His grandmother, Lucretia Ledyard Sands, had been widowed young and married Ebenezer Stevens, a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army during the Revolution, who later became a major general in the New York State militia and a successful merchant. After Stevens's death, Lucretia's son, by him, John Austin Stevens, became a prominent banker. The Stevens and Sands families intertwined through marriage and business, creating a network of relationships that extended across New York's commercial and social elite. Samuel Jr. grew up with every advantage these connections could provide. He was educated at the best schools, introduced to the right families, and expected to take his place in the banking world or live as a gentleman of leisure on his inheritance. He chose the latter. By the time he married Anne, Samuel was known primarily as a sportsman. He rode well, hunted regularly, and belonged to all the proper clubs. The Meadowbrook Hunt on Long Island attracted the wealthiest young men in New York, and Samuel was among them. He wore the right clothes, knew the right people, and lived the kind of life that society expected from young men of his class. Anne and Samuel's marriage began in the traditional pattern. They established a household in New York City for the winter social season and spent summers in Southampton on Long Island, where the ocean breezes and relative privacy offered escape from the city's heat and intensity. The first child arrived in 1881 or early 1882, a daughter who lived only briefly. Infant mortality in the Gilded Age touched even the wealthiest families. Medicine had advanced, but not enough. Infections that would later be easily treatable with antibiotics still killed babies born into houses with the finest doctors and the most attentive nurses. Anne buried her first child before that child had a name that would appear in historical records. On April 11, 1884, exactly 2 years after her wedding day, Anne gave birth to a son. She and Samuel named him Samuel Stevens Sands III, continuing the family tradition of naming first sons after their fathers. The boy was healthy, strong, and everything a young couple could hope for in an heir. 14 months later, on May 5, 1885, Anne delivered another son. They named him George Winthrop Sands, choosing Winthrop as his middle name in honor of old New York families who had been part of their social circle for generations. Anne had 2 living sons and a position as one of the young matrons of New York society. Her father was prosperous and influential. Her husband's family brought equal standing. The future stretched ahead with every prospect for happiness and stability. The family divided their time between the city and Southampton, where the rhythm of Gilded Age summer life played out in an endless round of parties, tennis matches, sailing expeditions, and carefully orchestrated social gatherings. Samuel pursued his sporting interests while Anne managed their household and raised their sons. Young Samuel and George had nursemaids and tutors, the beginnings of an education that would prepare them to take their place in the same world their parents inhabited. Then in 1889, during a hunt at Meadowbrook Golf Club, Samuel Stevens Sands Jr. fell from his horse. The exact circumstances were never fully recorded. Perhaps the horse spooked at something in the brush. Perhaps Samuel took offense poorly and was thrown. What matters is that he fell badly enough to sustain injuries that killed him. He was 33 years old. Anne became a widow at age 28. She had 2 small boys to raise alone. Samuel III was 5 years old. George was 4. Neither would carry clear memories of their father into adulthood. They would know him only through photographs, through stories their mother told them, through the legacy of a name they carried but could barely remember receiving. Anne's position was financially secure. The Sands family fortune ensured that Samuel's widow and sons would never want for money. Her own Harriman inheritance provided additional security, but financial security could not replace a husband or give her sons a father. Society offered sympathy, and then quietly began to speculate about whether she would remain a widow or, after a suitable period of mourning, seek another marriage. The social pressure on young widows was immense. A woman of 28 with 2 small children was expected to either retreat into permanent widowhood, dedicating herself entirely to raising her sons, or to remarry and provide those sons with a stepfather. Anne would choose the latter path, though perhaps not as quickly as some expected. But within months of Samuel's death, though the exact timeline is unclear in historical records, Anne met Lewis Morris Rutherford, Jr. Lewis was born in 1859, which made him 30 years old when he entered Anne's life. 2 years younger than she was. His father, Lewis Morris Rutherford, had been one of the most distinguished amateur scientists in America. The elder Rutherford had studied law and practiced briefly, but his true passion was astronomy. Using his considerable family wealth, he built a private observatory on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan, equipped it with telescopes and photographic equipment of his own design, and proceeded to make genuine contributions to astronomical science. Lewis Morris Rutherford Sr. pioneered the use of photography in astronomy. He mapped the moon in extraordinary detail for the era, photographed the sun, studied stellar spectra, and published findings that professional astronomers cited with respect. His observatory became a gathering place for scientists and intellectuals. He corresponded with the leading astronomers of Europe and America. When he died, the scientific community mourned him as one of their own, despite his status as an amateur. A gentleman scientist in the old tradition who pursued knowledge for its own sake, rather than for academic advancement or professional recognition. Lewis Jr. inherited his father's name, his family's wealth, and connections to some of New York's oldest lineages. The Rutherfords descended from the Livingston family, whose land holdings and political influence stretched back to colonial times. When Lewis Jr. married Anne, he was bringing her into a world of old New York aristocracy that differed subtly from the banking and commercial wealth of her own family and her first husband's family. The Livingstons and Rutherfords had been prominent when the Harrimans and Sands were still building their fortunes. There was prestige in those old names that newer money could not quite match, a social validation that Anne's Harriman wealth and Vanderbilt marriage would later seek. Lewis became stepfather to Samuel and George, both still very young boys who had lost their father and needed male guidance. The historical record is largely silent on how Lewis fulfilled this role, whether he was affectionate or distant, engaged or merely dutiful. What we know is that the boys kept their Sands name and their Sands inheritance, maintaining their connection to their father's family even as their mother remarried. Anne and Lewis had 2 daughters. Margaret Stuyvesant Rutherford was born in the early 1890s, her middle name chosen to honor another old New York family, the Stuyvesants, whose Dutch colonial roots gave them a cachet that even the wealthiest railroad barons could not purchase. Barbara Cairncross Rutherford followed. The exact birth dates of both daughters are unclear in available records, but they were young children by the late 1890s. Anne now presided over a blended household of 4 children, 2 sons from her first marriage who were approaching adolescence, and 2 daughters from her second marriage who were still small. She managed nursemaids and tutors, a household staff, and the social obligations that came with being Mrs. Lewis Morris Rutherford, Jr. The family maintained appropriate residences, attended appropriate gatherings, and moved in circles where everyone knew everyone's lineage back through multiple generations. In 1901, Lewis Morris Rutherford, Jr. died in Switzerland. He was only 42 years old. The cause of his death remains unclear in historical records. Perhaps he had gone to Switzerland for his health, seeking the mountain air that was thought to cure various ailments. Perhaps he was there on holiday when illness or accident overtook him. What is certain is that his body was returned to New York, and Anne found herself a widow for the second time. She was 40 years old. Her sons Samuel and George were 16 and 15, on the cusp of manhood. They would enter Harvard and begin their own lives soon. Her daughters Margaret and Barbara were still young enough to need their mother's daily presence and guidance. Anne had been married twice, widowed twice, and had buried a husband and an infant daughter. The pattern would have seemed clear to her friends and family. Anne Harriman Rutherford was destined to remain a widow, to raise her daughters, to watch her sons establish themselves, and to live out her years in the kind of respectable retirement that wealthy widows were expected to embrace. But Anne had other plans. On April 29, 1903, in London at St. Mark's Church, Anne Harriman Rutherford became Anne Harriman Vanderbilt, wife to one of the richest men in America, and stepmother to children whose names appeared regularly in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. William Kissam Vanderbilt, known to family and friends as William K., was born March 4, 1849, the grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, whose shipping and railroad empire had made him the wealthiest man in America when he died in 1877. The Commodore's will had left the bulk of his fortune to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, bypassing most of his other children in favor of keeping the empire intact under single control. William Henry had expanded the fortune before his own death in 1885, leaving an estate valued at $200 million, the largest inheritance in American history to that point. William Kissam was one of William Henry's 4 sons, and while he was not the eldest and would not control the family's railroad empire, he received a substantial inheritance that made him independently wealthy beyond the dreams of most Americans. His portion of the fortune, combined with his management of certain Vanderbilt railroad interests, kept him among the richest men in the country for his entire adult life. William K. grew up in a world where money was never an obstacle to anything he might want. The family lived in a mansion on Fifth Avenue. They owned yachts and racehorses. They traveled to Europe regularly and moved in circles that included European aristocracy, American industrial titans, and anyone else whose wealth or title gave them entree to the upper reaches of society. In 1875, William married Alva Erskine Smith, the daughter of Murray Forbes Smith, a commission merchant from Mobile, Alabama, and Phoebe Ann Desha, whose father had served in the U.S. House of Representatives. Alva was beautiful, intelligent, ambitious, and absolutely determined to force her way into the highest levels of New York society, despite not being born into it. At the time of her marriage, the old Knickerbocker families, descended from colonial Dutch and English settlers, still controlled New York's social hierarchy. The Mrs. Astor, Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor, decided who was acceptable and who was not through the simple mechanism of her invitation list. If you were invited to Mrs. Astor's parties, you were in society. If you were not invited, you did not exist socially, regardless of how much money you had. Alva set out to break this system. She convinced William to build her a mansion designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and introduced French Renaissance design to American architecture. She hosted a costume ball in 1883 that became legendary. She forced Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her by the simple expedient of making her ball the event of the season, and then making it clear that Mrs. Astor's daughter would not receive an invitation unless Mrs. Astor called on Alva first, something the older woman had never done. Mrs. Astor called. Alva won. New York society was never quite the same after that. William and Alva had 3 children. Consuelo, born March 2, 1877, would become the most famous of them. In 1895, Alva forced the 18-year-old Consuelo to marry Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, first cousin to Winston Churchill. The Duke got $2.5 million, now worth more than $70 million, which he used to renovate and landscape Blenheim Palace. The Vanderbilts got a duchess in the family and the social validation that came with a British title. Consuelo got a husband she did not love and a marriage that would eventually end in divorce, though not before she had produced 2 sons and secured the Marlborough succession. William Kissam Vanderbilt, Jr., called Willie, was born March 2, 1878. He would follow his father into railroad management and become known as a yachtsman and automobile racing enthusiast. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt was born July 6, 1884. He would win the America's Cup 3 times, invent contract bridge, and become the last Vanderbilt to serve actively in the management of the family's railroad interests. But the marriage between William and Alva deteriorated through the 1880s and early 90s. The reasons were complex. William's affair with Nellie Neustretter became known in society circles. Alva's own ambitions and her domineering personality created tensions. Whatever the specific causes, in March of 1895, Alva divorced William, an extraordinary act for a woman of her social position at a time when divorce was considered scandalous, even in less prominent families. The grounds for divorce were allegations of William's adultery. Alva received a financial settlement reported to exceed $10 million, an enormous sum that guaranteed her financial independence for the rest of her life. In January of 1896, she married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a banker and horse breeder who had been a friend of both Vanderbilts. Alva would outlive Belmont, dying in 1933 after a long career as a suffragist and advocate for women's rights. William remained unmarried for 8 years after the divorce. He traveled extensively, spent time in France, where he kept a chateau and racing stables at Poissy, and lived the life of a wealthy bachelor moving between continents and social worlds. At 54, he was no longer interested in building a dynasty. He had 3 adult children. His railroad interests ran smoothly with or without his daily attention. What he wanted, apparently, was companionship, someone mature and cultured who understood his world and would not make demands he could not meet. Anne, at 42, offered exactly that. She brought her own Harriman fortune, her own social position established through 2 previous marriages, and the maturity of a woman who had survived 2 widowhoods and raised 4 children. She was not a breathless young bride hoping to transform her life through marriage to a Vanderbilt. She was an established figure in her own right, choosing to marry William because it suited her, not because she needed him. The wedding in London was attended by Consuelo, now the Duchess of Marlborough, and her husband, the Duke. William's sons were present. Anne's daughters from her second marriage, Margaret and Barbara, joined the celebration. The press on both sides of the Atlantic covered the wedding as the union of 2 great American fortunes, Harriman banking and railroad money joining with Vanderbilt railroad wealth. Anne would have no children with William. At their ages, neither expected it. What Anne gained through this marriage was access to properties that together represented one of the greatest collections of real estate in America, a position as one of the most prominent hostesses in New York and Paris, and the complications that would come when William eventually died and his will revealed exactly what being Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt had actually meant in legal terms. The mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue had been built between 1878 and 1883 by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had designed Alva's famous costume ball venue and who would design several other Vanderbilt properties. Hunt had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to complete the full course there. And he brought French architectural principles to American clients who wanted their homes to reflect European grandeur. The house at 660 Fifth Avenue was designed as a French Renaissance chateau, a style that Hunt would use repeatedly for Vanderbilt commissions. The mansion rose from the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street. Its gray limestone facade carved with elaborate detail that required master stone carvers working for months to complete. Gargoyles leaned from the roofline. Ornamental medallions decorated the walls. Every surface carried some carved element that demonstrated the wealth required to command such craftsmanship. The house was known as the Petit Chateau, though there was nothing petit about it. The name simply distinguished it from the much larger Château-sur-Mer that the Vanderbilts maintained in Newport. Inside, the mansion featured marble halls where footsteps echoed on polished stone. The walls were covered with gilded plasterwork, the ceilings painted with allegorical scenes. Gas lighting, later converted to electric, illuminated rooms filled with furniture imported from Europe and paintings collected on regular trips to Paris, Rome, and London. The house had been built for William and Alva. It represented Alva's ambitions, her taste, her determination to have a home that would force New York society to acknowledge Vanderbilt's standing. Anne inherited it as William's third wife, moving into rooms that Alva had designed, sleeping in beds that Alva had chosen, receiving guests in a drawing room where Alva had staged her triumphs. Friends noted that Anne had more modest tastes than the original mistress of the house. She preferred simpler arrangements, fewer ostentatious displays, but she adapted to living in a mansion that proclaimed Vanderbilt wealth with every carved stone and gilded surface. The house would be hers to occupy from 1903 until William's death in 1920, but she would never truly own it. The property belonged to William, and when he died, it would belong to the estate for the executors to dispose of as they thought appropriate. Idle Hour stretched across 900 acres in Oakdale on Long Island, positioned along the eastern bank of the Connetquot River, where it widened before flowing into the Great South Bay. The location was ideal for a country estate. The river provided water access. The surrounding land was fertile enough for gardens and fields, but also included enough forest to support hunting. The property was large enough that William could create his own private world, separate from the increasing development of Long Island's South Shore. William and Alva built the original mansion between 1878 and 1882. Richard Morris Hunt designed a wooden Tudor-style structure with 60 rooms, large enough to house the family and their guests, but smaller than the 110-room palace that would replace it. The original Idle Hour served as a hunting lodge and summer retreat. Consuelo honeymooned there when she married the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. On April 15, 1899, during William K. Vanderbilt Jr.'s honeymoon with his bride Virginia Fair Vanderbilt, fire broke out in the mansion. The couple escaped. The structure did not. Wooden construction and 19th century firefighting capabilities meant that once the flames took hold, nothing could save it. By morning, only smoking ruins remained. William did not hesitate. Within weeks, he had hired Richard Howland Hunt, the son of the original architect, who had taken over his father's practice after the elder Hunt's death. Richard Howland Hunt designed a replacement mansion intended to be permanent and fireproof. Instead of wood, he used red brick and gray stone. The structure rose in an L shape, Beaux-Arts in style, with classical proportions and careful attention to how the building sat in its landscape. Construction began in 1899 and was completed in 1901, an extraordinarily fast schedule for a mansion of this scale. The new Idle Hour contained 110 rooms and 45 bathrooms, enough space to house the family, their guests, and a full complement of servants. The building covered 70,000 square feet. Workers installed modern plumbing, electric lighting powered by the estate's own generator, and heating systems that could keep the massive structure comfortable even in winter. Between 1902 and 1904, William hired the architectural firm of Warren and Wetmore to add extensions. They designed a palm court where tropical plants could be maintained year-round under glass. They added bachelor's quarters that included an indoor tennis court, a fives court for playing the Old English game, a smoking room decorated in Turkish style, and multiple guest suites. The garage could accommodate 100 automobiles, a staggering number in an era when most families owned one car if they owned any at all. The cost was $6 million, approximately $111 million in today's currency. The expense included not just the mansion, but also the outbuildings. Isaac H. Green designed gatehouses in an English cottage style that guarded the entrances to the estate. A clock tower stood near one entrance, a tea house perched on the water's edge, designed as a place where family and guests could take refreshments while watching boats on the river. A white marble mausoleum stood among the trees, built to house the Vanderbilt family's dead. That mausoleum would become important in ways William could not have anticipated when he commissioned it. The grounds were landscaped with careful attention to creating views, vistas, and garden rooms. Paths wound through wooded areas. Formal gardens displayed seasonal flowers. Lawns stretched from the house to the river. Maintained by a staff of groundskeepers who worked full-time to keep the estate looking manicured. Anne would come to know Idle Hour well. In July of 1913, her son Samuel would be buried in the White Mausoleum. She would visit his grave there for 7 years, until William's death transferred the property to Harold and made even visiting a courtesy dependent on her stepson's permission. Marble House stood in Newport, Rhode Island, the summer cottage that William had given Alva as a 35th birthday present. Hunt designed it between 1888 and 1892, modeling it after the Petit Trianon at Versailles. The construction required 500,000 cubic feet of marble, shipped from quarries and carved by craftsmen who understood how to work the stone without breaking it. The house represented the peak of Gilded Age excess. A summer cottage that cost $7 million and required 20 servants just to maintain it when the family was not in residence. Alva received Marble House in the divorce settlement. She would eventually give it to Harold. But during William's lifetime and Anne's marriage to him, the question of who controlled Marble House remained complicated. William retained some interest. Anne would spend summers there when it suited the family's plans. Navigating the awkwardness of occupying a house built by William for another woman, decorated to that woman's taste, and still carrying the imprint of Alva's personality in every room. Beyond the American properties, William maintained a chateau and racing stables at Poissy, France, about 20 miles from Paris along the Seine. He loved France with the passion of a man who found in French culture something that American society could not provide. The chateau served as his base for spending months at a time in Europe, attending horse races, entertaining French friends who appreciated his wealth, but did not subject him to the social climbing and status anxiety that characterized New York. He also kept a residence at 10 Rue Leroux in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, a fashionable address in a neighborhood populated by wealthy Parisians and Americans who maintained European homes. Anne would come to love Paris as well. The city offered a different kind of society, one less rigidly hierarchical than New York's, more willing to accept Americans with money and manners, more focused on cultural and intellectual achievement rather than pure pedigree. She would maintain the Rue LaRue residence after William's death and divide her final years between Paris and New York, never quite belonging fully to either place, but comfortable in both. Together, these properties constituted the empire that Anne had access to as Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt. She could live in them, entertain in them, bring her daughters to them, and call them home. But she did not own them. They were William's properties, part of the Vanderbilt estate, subject to the terms of whatever Will William chose to write. Access, as Anne would discover, is not ownership. Inside these properties, Anne lived a life that split between two continents and moved in the highest circles of society on both sides of the Atlantic. The sheer logistics of maintaining this existence required staff, coordination, and resources that only the wealthiest families could command. In New York, the household at 665th Avenue employed dozens of servants. Butlers managed the formal service. Housemaids cleaned rooms and maintained linens. Cooks staffed kitchens large enough to prepare multi-course dinners for dozens of guests. Footmen attended to details that the family barely noticed, but that distinguished a properly run household from a merely wealthy one. At idle hour, the staff count increased. Groundskeepers maintained the lawns and gardens. Grooms cared for horses. Mechanics serviced the automobiles in the garage. Kitchen staff worked full-time to feed not just the family and their guests, but also the small army of workers required to keep a 900-acre estate functioning. In Paris, the household at 10 Rue LaRue operated on a slightly smaller scale, but still required French servants who understood how to maintain an American establishment in a French city, navigating the differences in markets, service expectations, and social customs. On an evening early in 1911, Anne hosted a dinner at 665th Avenue that would be remembered decades later as an example of what wealth could accomplish when directed by someone with taste and intelligence. Engelbert Humperdinck was in New York for the Metropolitan Opera's premiere of his opera Die Königskinder, or The King's Children, a fairy tale opera that had premiered in Munich the previous year. Giacomo Puccini was in the city for the Metropolitan's premiere of his opera, The Girl of the Golden West, based on a David Belasco play and set in California during the Gold Rush. These were two of the most celebrated opera composers in the world, both in New York at the same time for major premieres at the Metropolitan. Anne brought them both to her table. The guest list included figures from New York's cultural elite, people who understood opera and could converse intelligently with the composers. After dinner, servants cleared the table, and the company moved to the music room. A piano stood ready. Joseph Hoffman, one of the greatest pianists of the era, sat down. Humperdinck stood on one side of the piano. Puccini stood on the other. Hoffman played while the two composers listened, occasionally commenting, discussing technique and interpretation, treating the assembled guests to an evening of music and conversation that money alone could not purchase. It required taste to assemble the right people, intelligence to create an atmosphere where artists felt comfortable, and enough cultural knowledge to understand what would make the evening memorable rather than merely expensive. Eleanor Robson Belmont, who was present that night, would recall it decades later when asked about the great hostesses of the Gilded Age. Anne was among them. She said someone who used wealth to create experiences rather than simply display it. Anne entertained regularly in New York and Paris. The yacht Valiant became a floating salon where multi-day cruises could include conversations about art, literature, music, and politics that lasted late into the night. She gathered people who had something to say, who could contribute to a conversation rather than simply attend it. This was how the most successful hostesses distinguished themselves from women who merely had money and servants. Anne's public face was that of a cultivated hostess and patron, but she also engaged seriously with charitable work that addressed real problems. In 1903, the same year she married William, she joined with Anne Tracy Morgan, J.P., Morgan's youngest daughter, and Elizabeth Marbury, a theatrical and literary agent who had helped found the modern profession of playbrokering, to organize the Colony Club. This was the first women's social club in New York, a revolutionary idea at a time when men had clubs throughout the city, but women had no equivalent spaces. Men could retreat to the Union Club, the Knickerbocker Club, the Metropolitan Club, or a dozen others to conduct business, have lunch, read newspapers, and escape their homes. Women had no such option. The Colony Club would change that. Anne Morgan and Elizabeth Marbury worked together to establish the club, recruit members from New York's most prominent families, and engage Stanford White, then the city's most famous architect, to design the interiors. White created spaces that mixed elegance with comfort, providing rooms for dining, reading, exercise, and socializing. The club opened its doors and immediately became essential to the lives of women who wanted something beyond home and charity committee meetings. Anne served as a founding member and continued her involvement even as other interests claimed her attention. Her most significant philanthropic project began taking shape around 1909. Tuberculosis was killing thousands of New Yorkers every year, particularly among the poor who lived in crowded tenements where the disease spread easily. The medical community understood by this time that fresh air and sunlight could help tuberculosis patients, but most sufferers lived in buildings where windows opened onto narrow air shafts or faced other buildings just feet away. Light and air were luxuries the poor could not afford. Anne decided to build housing specifically for tuberculosis patients and their families. Between 1909 and 1910, she financed the construction of 4 large apartment buildings on Avenue A, which would later be renamed York Avenue, between 77th and 78th Streets. The project cost $1 million, all of it Anne's money. Not Vanderbilt money, not her husband's contribution, but her personal wealth directed toward a specific social problem. She hired architect Henry Atterbury Smith to design what became known as the open-stair apartments. Smith created a revolutionary design for the era. Instead of interior stairwells enclosed in dark shafts, the buildings featured staircases that were open to the air. Windows were large and opened wide. Apartments were designed to maximize cross-ventilation. Every unit received sunlight for at least part of the day. The concept was that tuberculosis patients could live in these apartments with their families, receiving the fresh air and light that doctors recommended, while remaining in their communities rather than being sent to sanatoriums far from the city. The buildings contained 384 apartments. The rents were set at levels working-class families could afford. The intention was not to make a profit, but to provide a service. Anne paid for construction and accepted that the buildings might lose money if rents did not cover maintenance costs. The project was completed in 1910. The buildings stood as proof that housing could be both affordable and healthy, that tuberculosis patients did not need to be segregated in institutions, that fresh air and light could be incorporated into urban housing if someone was willing to pay for it. The buildings still stand today, still occupied, still serving families more than a century after Anne wrote the check. The apartments have been renovated and updated, but the core concept of air and light remains embedded in their design. In 1916, Anne hosted another fundraiser, this time for the war sufferers of Venice. World War I had devastated Italy. Venice's artistic treasures were at risk. Refugees needed assistance. Anne opened her home, gathered New York's wealthy, and raised money to send to Italian relief organizations. The French government noticed. In 1919, France made Anne a Knight of the Légion d'honneur, the country's highest decoration for merit, created by Napoleon and awarded to those who had rendered distinguished service to France. For Anne, that service included her charitable work during the war and her role in strengthening French-American cultural ties through her entertaining and support of French artists in New York. In 1932, France elevated her to Officer of the Légion d'honneur, the next rank in the order. She would be the first woman to receive a gold medal from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs for her service to France. These were not honorary titles given to wealthy Americans who donated money. They represented genuine recognition of sustained effort over decades. The Colony Club, the tuberculosis housing, the Venice fundraiser, and later the Sutton Place development would all reveal the same pattern. Harriman Vanderbilt built communities for those who had been excluded. First women excluded from men's clubs, then tuberculosis patients excluded from decent housing, then war sufferers excluded from aid, then society women excluded from fashionable neighborhoods by their own unconventional choices. She identified gaps in social infrastructure and filled them. She saw suffering and addressed it with money directed intelligently rather than sentimentally. She used her wealth as an instrument of change, not merely as a cushion for her own comfort or a tool for social climbing. This was the life Anne had built by the time World War I ended and the 1920s began. She was an established figure in New York and Paris, a respected philanthropist, a woman whose name carried weight independent of her husband's Vanderbilt title. But her sons, from her first marriage, were moving into adulthood, and the machines that defined the modern era were about to demand a price she could not pay. But even as Anne built her reputation as a philanthropist and cultivated tastemaker in two countries, the sons from her first marriage were approaching manhood, and the automobiles that represented modernity's promise would prove to be their destruction. In 1908, somewhere on the road between Triel and Poissy in France, not far from the Vanderbilt family's chateau and racing stables, George Winthrop Sands was driving a 30-horsepower De Dietrich automobile when something went wrong. The De Dietrich was a semi-racing type, built by a French manufacturer known for speed rather than safety. It could reach velocities that seemed incredible to a generation that had grown up with horses as the fastest mode of transport. Contemporary witnesses and police reports estimated that George was traveling at 100 kilometers per hour when the accident occurred. That translates to 62 miles per hour on roads designed for horse-drawn wagons, roads without lane markings or guardrails, roads that curved and dipped without warning. George was 23 years old, the son of a banking family, raised with every advantage that Gilded Age wealth could provide. He had entered Harvard in 1903, part of the same class system that educated men of his background to take their place in business or government, or the management of inherited wealth. In June of 1906, he had purchased a seat on the New York Stock Exchange for several $100,000. The price required to join that exclusive club. He had become a stockbroker, working in the family business of managing money and facilitating trades. He had married Tayo Newton and had children. His future appeared secure. He was returning from Deauville on the Norman coast, where wealthy Parisians and visiting Americans gathered for horse racing and seaside entertainments. Robert Picken, a Scottish chauffeur employed by the Vanderbilt household in France, sat beside him. Whether Picken was actually driving or whether George insisted on taking the wheel himself is unclear from the fragmentary records. What is certain is that the automobile left the road. The physics of what happens when a 2-ton vehicle traveling at high speed loses control are brutal and unforgiving. The car likely rolled, crushing the passenger compartment. George Winthrop Sands died somewhere between Triel and Poissy. Picken survived with bruises, suggesting he was thrown clear or protected by some accident of positioning. Initial reports confused the incident. Telegrams reached Paris announcing that William K. Vanderbilt had been seriously injured in an automobile accident. Friends and business associates began making inquiries. Reporters scrambled to confirm details. Within hours, investigators had established that William was in Deauville at the time of the accident, nowhere near the crash site. The dead man was George Sands, Anne's son from her first marriage, the stepson of William K. Vanderbilt, but not his heir, not his blood relation, not even bearing the Vanderbilt name. Still, George's death resonated through New York society because it represented a pattern that was becoming grimly familiar. Young men of wealth and status, given access to powerful automobiles, were dying at alarming rates. The machines were too fast for the roads. The drivers were too inexperienced for the speed. The combination was deadly. 5 years passed. Anne raised her remaining son, watched her daughters grow, continued her philanthropic work, and managed her role as Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt. Then on July 2, 1913, Samuel Stevens Sands III was driving near West Hampton on Long Island when his automobile crashed. Samuel was 29 years old, 6 years older than his brother had been when the French Road claimed him. Samuel had married Gertrude Allison Sheldon on October 18, 1910, in a ceremony attended by New York society families who knew both the Sands and Sheldon names. Gertrude came from a wealthy family herself. Her father was among the New York elite who maintained properties on Long Island and in the city. The marriage united two families of similar standing. On October 19, 1911, almost exactly a year after the wedding, Gertrude gave birth to a son. They named him Samuel Stevens Sands IV. continuing the family tradition of passing the name down through generations. Young Samuel was 1 year and 8 months old when his father died. He would grow up, as his father had, without clear memories of the man whose name he carried. The details of Samuel's accident are sparse in the historical record. We know it occurred near West Hampton. We know it involved an automobile. We know Samuel died. Whether he was driving or riding as a passenger, whether the car was going too fast for conditions, whether another vehicle was involved, whether mechanical failure played a role, none of this was recorded in the newspaper accounts that survive. What the newspapers did note was the grim symmetry. One report stated plainly that the young man met death just as his brother, G. Winthrop Sands, met death in France 5 years ago. Another observed that his father, Samuel Stevens Sands, Jr., had been killed in a riding accident. The pattern was unmistakable. Horses had killed the father. Automobiles had killed both sons. Technology and sport, the tools of leisure for wealthy men, had wiped out 3 generations of Sands men before any of them reached their 40th birthday. Anne had now buried her first husband and both of the sons she had given birth to. Samuel was the baby she had held when he was born on her 2nd wedding anniversary. George was the toddler who had learned to walk while his mother was still in mourning for his father. She had raised them, educated them, watched them become men, and now they were both gone. After Samuel's death, his body was brought to Idle Hour. William K. Vanderbilt, who was not Samuel's father, who had no blood relation to the young man, who had married Anne only a decade earlier when Samuel was already a grown adult, made a decision that spoke to either genuine kindness or simple pragmatism. He gave permission for Samuel's body to be interred in the white marble mausoleum that stood on the Idle Hour grounds. The mausoleum had been built as part of the estate's infrastructure, a place where Vanderbilt family members could be buried without the need for transport to distant cemeteries. William allowed Anne to use it for her son. Samuel Stevens Sands III was laid to rest in the White Mausoleum on 900 acres overlooking the Connetquot River, on property his mother had come to think of as home. The burial seemed permanent. The marble structure was solid. The estate was secure in Vanderbilt ownership. Anne assumed her son would rest there undisturbed for generations, that she could visit his grave whenever she wished, that even after her own death, the mausoleum would stand as a memorial to her son. In less than 8 years, the transfer of property ownership would prove her wrong. On July 22, 1920, William Kissam Vanderbilt died in Paris at the age of 71, leaving Anne a widow for the 3rd time in her life. She was 59 years old. She had been married to William for 17 years, longer than either of her previous marriages, long enough that being Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt had become her primary identity in the eyes of society. She had lived in his houses, traveled on his yacht, entertained his friends, and carved out her own sphere of influence as a philanthropist and hostess. Now she would discover exactly what the title Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt had meant in legal terms, and the answer would not be what her years of marriage might have suggested. William had been in failing health for some time. He spent his final months in Paris, the city he loved more than New York, surrounded by French friends and the comforts of European life that had sustained him through the years since his divorce from Alva. Anne was with him when he died. She arranged for his body to be transported back to New York for burial in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum at Moravian Cemetery on Staten Island. On August 28, 1920, just over a month after William's death, the law firm of Anderson and Anderson released a summary of William's will to the press. The estate was valued at somewhere between $40 million and $100 million, a range so large that it reflected both the complexity of valuing railroad shares, real estate holdings, art collections, and other assets, and the difficulty of determining market value for properties that were rarely sold. The final accounting, after all assets had been inventoried and appraised, would settle on a figure of $54,530,966. William Kissam Vanderbilt had been one of the richest men in America when he died. The question was how he wanted that wealth distributed. The will named William K. Vanderbilt, Jr. and Harold Sterling Vanderbilt as co-executors and left them the residuary estate in equal shares. This meant that after all specific bequests and trusts had been satisfied, everything that remained would be divided between William's 2 sons. The bulk of the Vanderbilt fortune would stay in the Vanderbilt family, passing to the next generation of men who carried the name. Before the residuary distribution, the will made specific gifts and established trusts totaling $13,520,000 to Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess of Marlborough. The will left nothing. The document explained that William had previously given her $5 million, which he considered sufficient provision. The state of New York would later press a claim for $500,000 in taxes on that gift, arguing that it had been made in contemplation of death and should be taxed as part of the estate. To William K. Vanderbilt III, the son of William Jr. and thus William's grandson, the will established a trust of $1 million. The document explained that no bequests were being made to Consuelo's daughters or to William Jr.'s daughters because the testator believed their fathers would be better able than he to determine what provision should be made for them. To Margaret Rutherford Mills and Barbara Rutherford Hatch, Anne's two daughters from her second marriage to Lewis Rutherford, the will gave $100,000 each. These young women were not William's children, not related to him by blood, but they were the daughters of the woman he had married. The bequests acknowledged that relationship while making clear that they were not heirs in the same way that William's own children were heirs. And to Anne Harriman Vanderbilt herself, the will specified that she would receive $109,196.47 in cash. The precision of the figures suggested that this was some specific sum, perhaps representing the balance of an account or the value of certain securities, rather than a round number chosen to provide for her needs. The will further specified that William's two sons would select securities worth $2,500,000 from the estate and place them in trust for Anne's benefit. She would receive the income from this trust during her lifetime. At her death, the principal would be paid to her issue, as she might appoint by will or in default of such appointment, in equal shares among her children. The structure was clear. Anne had income, not capital. She had access to money the trust generated, but she could not spend the principal. She could not sell the securities and use the proceeds for some large purchase. She could direct where the principal would go after her death, but while she lived, the $2,500,000 belonged to the trust managed by William's sons, invested as they thought appropriate. Anne received income, not ownership. The will contained other provisions that affected Anne indirectly. It specified that William's interest in certain properties, owned jointly with the trustees of Alfred G. Vanderbilt's estate, would go to William K. Vanderbilt, Jr. Alfred had been William's nephew, the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who had gone down with the Lusitania in 1915, giving his life jacket to a woman passenger, even though he could not swim. The Vanderbilt family fortune was entangled across multiple estates and trusts, with pieces of it held jointly by different family members in arrangements designed to minimize taxes and maintain control. The will also addressed Marble House in Newport. It stated that William's personal property in Marble House would go to whichever of his sons became the owner of the house at the death of their mother, Alva. If neither son became the owner, then such property would go to Harold if he survived Alva, and if he did not survive her, then to William Jr. The provision revealed that even though Alva had received Marble House in the divorce settlement 25 years earlier, the question of who would ultimately inherit it remained tied up in complex testamentary provisions. Anne's potential interest in even the contents of Marble House depended on decisions her stepsons and her stepchildren's mother would make. And then there was idle hour. The will left the estate specifically to Harold Sterling Vanderbilt. The 900 acres, the 110-room mansion, the stables, the gatehouses, the powerhouse, and the white marble mausoleum where Anne's son had been buried for 7 years, all of it belonged to Harold now. Anne had no legal interest in the property. She could visit only if Harold invited her. The transfer taxes alone would be extraordinary. The will directed that all transfer taxes on the bequests and trusts should be paid from the residuary estate, meaning that William's sons would receive their inheritances reduced by the cost of taxes on everyone's bequests. The Suffolk County inheritance tax would be $1,934,571, the largest inheritance tax in the history of the county. New York State would claim additional millions. The federal estate tax, a relatively new invention, would take its share. By the time all the taxes were paid and all the specific bequests satisfied, the residuary estate that went to William's sons would be substantially smaller than $54 million, though still an enormous fortune by any measure. The newspapers carried full details of the will. Society read the numbers carefully and drew conclusions. Anne Harriman Vanderbilt had lived for 17 years as one of the richest women in America. She had occupied mansions, sailed on yachts, entertained in Paris and New York, but when the legal documents were probated and the assets distributed, she received $109,000 in cash and a trust that gave her income but no control. Her stepdaughters received nothing. Her own daughters from her second marriage each received $100,000, almost exactly what Anne received in cash. The sons inherited everything else. Anne returned to New York from Paris and discovered exactly what settling an estate meant when you had lived in palaces you did not own. The mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue belonged to the estate now, to be administered by the executors and eventually disposed of according to their judgment. Idlehour had passed directly to Harold through the specific bequest in the will. Even Marblehouse's future was tied to complex provisions involving William's children and their mother Alva. Anne had the income from her trust. She had her Harriman inheritance, which had remained her separate property through all 3 marriages. She had the money she had received from the Sands family when her first husband died, and from the Rutherford family when her second husband died. She had means. She was not poor by any measure that would make sense to ordinary Americans, but she did not have the Vanderbilt properties. Everything that had defined her life for 17 years, every mansion and estate and yacht, would have to be surrendered to the executors or the new owners. By November of 1920, just 4 months after William's death, Anne had learned the practical difference between living in a mansion and owning one. She sold the house at 660 Fifth Avenue to the Empire Trust Company for $3 million. Her stated reason to friends and reporters was that she preferred more modest surroundings, that the grand Fifth Avenue chateau had always been more Alva's style than hers, that she wanted something simpler and more manageable. The truth was more complicated. She had access to substantial wealth but limited ownership of specific assets. She needed liquid capital that she could control absolutely. The mansion was hers to sell because William's will had not specifically bequeathed it, apparently assuming that Anne would wish to dispose of it rather than continue maintaining a house that required dozens of servants and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to operate. The Empire Trust Company bought one of New York's most famous houses for $3 million. They would hold it for 6 years before demolishing it in 1926 to make way for an office building. The French Renaissance chateau would be reduced to rubble, its carved limestone facade broken into pieces, its marble interiors stripped and scattered. The mansion that Richard Morris Hunt had designed to announce Vanderbilt wealth and Alva's arrival in society would become a commercial building housing insurance offices and corporate headquarters. But that destruction was still years away in November of 1920. For Anne, what mattered was converting the house into $3 million she could control. In 1921, Anne also sold Stepping Stones, the country estate in Wheatley Hills in Jericho on Long Island. The property comprised approximately 125 acres of carefully landscaped grounds surrounding a house that William had commissioned from architect John R. Hill. The estate had served as a country retreat, close enough to New York for weekend visits, but far enough away to provide genuine escape from the city. Anne sold it to Ormond Gerald Smith for $500,000. Exactly what Smith did with the property after that is unclear in the historical record. It did not become a famous estate or a public park. It was either maintained as a private residence or subdivided and developed. It simply disappeared from the documented history of Long Island's great estates. One among hundreds that were built in the Gilded Age, briefly owned by wealthy families and then sold off when circumstances changed. Within a year of William's death, Anne had liquidated 2 major properties for $3.5 million. The speed of the sales suggested something more than simple downsizing. She was converting property into cash, real estate into liquid assets. mansions into money she could invest or spend as she chose, without asking executors for permission or explaining her decisions to stepsons. Then came the matter that must have caused Anne more pain than all the property sales combined. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt now owned Idlehour. The 900 acres, the mansion, the outbuildings, and the white marble mausoleum all belonged to him. Samuel Stephen Sands III, buried there since July of 1913, was not Harold's brother or half-brother. He was not even William K. Vanderbilt's stepson in any meaningful sense, since William had married Anne years after Samuel was already a grown man. Samuel was the child of Anne's first marriage, dead from an automobile accident, resting in a tomb on property that had passed to Harold through William's will. The legal situation was clear. Harold owned the property. He had the right to determine what happened on that property. If he wanted to maintain the mausoleum as it was, he could. If he wanted it removed or relocated, that was his decision to make. Anne had no legal standing to insist that her son's grave remain on Harold's property. What conversation, if any, occurred between Anne and Harold about Samuel's burial is not recorded. Perhaps Harold made it clear that he did not want his stepbrother's body on the estate he now owned. Perhaps he was planning to sell Idlehour and did not want complications about burial rights affecting the sale. Perhaps Anne herself understood that remaining on her stepson's good graces for access to her own son's grave was an untenable position, and chose to relocate the body rather than depend on Harold's continuing permission. Whatever the reasoning and whoever initiated the decision, on January 18, 1921, Charles Daly, an undertaker from Islip, New York, arrived at Idlehour with the legal authority to open the white marble mausoleum. He and his assistants removed Samuel's casket from the tomb where it had rested for 7.5 years. They transported the casket to Fresh Pond Crematory in Queens, one of the largest crematories serving New York City. Samuel's body was reduced to ashes. Attorney William H. Earl, whose exact relationship to Anne or the Sands family is unclear, in the surviving records collected the ashes, and then they disappeared from documented history. The ashes were not placed in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum at Moravian Cemetery, where William and eventually Anne would be buried. They were not interred in any Sands family plot. They were not scattered in any recorded location. No death notice or memorial announcement specified where Samuel Stephen Sands III's remains finally came to rest. The 29-year-old man who died in an automobile accident, who left behind a widow and a 2-year-old son, who was buried in what his mother thought would be a permanent grave, had become ashes distributed or stored in some place that no one thought important enough to record for posterity. The property transfer had made Anne a trespasser at her own son's grave. The law had given her no standing to object when Harold, as the new owner, wanted the burial situation resolved. She could no longer visit Samuel's resting place because it no longer existed as a fixed location. The legal mechanisms that governed property inheritance, that protected family wealth by passing it to direct male heirs, that gave executors and beneficiaries absolute control over bequeathed property, all of these had functioned exactly as designed. And the result was that Anne lost even the ground where her child lay. But Anne Harriman Vanderbilt was not finished. In 1921, while she was still settling William's estate and dealing with the relocation of her son's body, she made a decision that society would mock and that she would transform into one of her greatest achievements. She purchased a house at 1 Sutton Place for $50,000 in a neighborhood that was known primarily for slaughterhouses, factories, and the kinds of industrial operations that respectable people avoided. Sutton Place had been developed back in the 1870s by the Sutton family, after whom the street was named. They had created a one-block strip of 24 brownstone row houses between 58th and 59th Streets, running from the East River west to Avenue A. The location along the river should have made it desirable. River views, fresh breezes, proximity to the water. These were amenities that wealthy New Yorkers sought in Newport and on Long Island's South Shore. But in Manhattan's East Side, the riverfront had become industrial. Meatpacking plants lined parts of the shore. The smell of slaughter and the sounds of factories drifted through the streets. Tenements crowded the blocks further inland, housing the workers who staffed the plants and warehouses. By the 1920s, the original brownstones had deteriorated. Paint peeled, stoops crumbled. The neighborhood was squalid, a place where respectable society did not live and did not visit. No one with Anne's social position and resources would choose such a location unless they had a specific vision that others could not see. The house she purchased had belonged to Effingham B. Sutton, whose family name had given the street its designation decades earlier. It was a modest structure by Vanderbilt standards, nothing like the mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue or the sprawling estate at Idlehour. The purchase price of $50,000 was a tiny fraction of what Anne had received from selling those properties. But Anne was not acting alone. She had co-conspirators who shared her vision of transforming this neglected neighborhood into something fashionable. Anne Tracy Morgan, the youngest daughter of financier J.P. Morgan had been Anne's friend and collaborator for years. They had worked together to found the Colony Club. They had entertained in each other's homes, supported each other's philanthropic projects, and maintained a friendship based on genuine mutual respect rather than mere social obligation. Anne Morgan was planning to purchase the adjacent property and build or renovate a house there. Elizabeth Marbury, the theatrical and literary agent who had essentially invented the modern profession of playbrokering, was also planning to buy nearby. Marbury had represented Oscar Wilde, helped launch George Bernard Shaw's career in America, and built a business managing the rights to theatrical works at a time when few people understood that intellectual property could be valuable. She had wealth, influence, and the kind of unconventional life that shocked some and impressed others. Anne's own sister, Emmeline Harriman Olin, the widow of William Earl Dodge III, who had remarried Stephen H. Olin, also bought property in the developing Sutton Place neighborhood. 4 women of immense wealth and established social position were relocating to what newspapers would call, with a mixture of mockery and fascination, an Amazon enclave. The New York Times ran a headline that announced Mrs. W. K. Vanderbilt to live in Avenue A, phrasing the relocation as if Anne were moving to a foreign country, or perhaps descending several social classes. Society pages questioned the wisdom of the move. Friends expressed concern that Anne was making a mistake, that the neighborhood was too far gone to ever become fashionable, that industrial smell and noise would make it unbearable, no matter how the houses themselves were renovated. Anne hired Mott B. Schmidt to transform the Sutton house into her new home. Schmidt, born in 1889, was then 32 years old and just beginning to build the reputation that would make him one of the most sought-after residential architects in New York. He had studied at the University of Pennsylvania and worked briefly for other architects before establishing his own practice. He understood American Georgian classical architecture with an intuition that allowed him to design houses that looked like they had stood for a century, even when they were newly built. Schmidt worked closely with Elsie de Wolfe, who had designed interiors for the Colony Club and had written The House in Good Taste, the book that essentially defined modern interior decorating as a profession. De Wolfe brought her aesthetic of light, color, and comfort that rejected the heavy Victorian clutter that had characterized the previous generation's homes. Together, Schmidt and de Wolfe transformed the Sutton house into something new. The renovation cost approximately $75,000. Added to the $50,000 purchase price, for a total investment of $125,000. The finished house measured 20 feet wide and 70 feet deep, a relatively modest footprint compared to the sprawling mansions Anne had occupied as Mrs. Vanderbilt. It rose 4 stories. Schmidt clad the exterior in Georgian brick, a warm red that aged beautifully. He painted the front door a distinctive blue that would become one of the house's most recognizable features. Inside, he created 13 rooms for family use, plus 17 additional rooms for the servants who would maintain the household. Schmidt's genius showed in how he maximized the narrow lot. He designed a spiral staircase that wound gracefully through the center of the house, creating visual drama in a confined space. He placed windows strategically to capture light throughout the day. He created terraced gardens that descended from the back of the house toward the East River, giving Anne the outdoor space that every proper house required. The garden designer, René Prahar, installed plantings that would flourish in the specific microclimate created by the river and the surrounding buildings. She designed the terraces with 2 center pillars topped with ornamental monkeys holding globes of light in their hands, a whimsical detail that became another signature element of the house. Anne Morgan's adjacent property at 3 Sutton Place was designed with the shared understanding that the two houses would share a common garden. Schmidt worked on both projects, creating homes that were individual but harmonious, each with its own character, but both contributing to a unified vision for what the neighborhood could become. The design drew direct inspiration from London's Cheyne Walk along the Chelsea embankment on the Thames, where Georgian townhouses faced the water in elegant rows, each distinct but all contributing to a unified streetscape. Schmidt gave his New York clients the same sense of river views combined with urban density, of private gardens hidden behind unified facades, of houses that respected their neighbors while expressing individual personality. Anne moved into 1 Sutton Place during 1921. She brought her Harriman taste for restraint and quality over ostentation. She brought her experience managing Vanderbilt properties and understanding how a house should function. And she brought her determination to prove that vision mattered more than convention, that a neighborhood could be transformed if the right people chose to live there. By January of 1929, the New York Times had changed its position on Sutton Place so completely that a reporter felt compelled to acknowledge the newspaper's earlier skepticism. The paper published an article that began by noting that 5 years earlier, when Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt established her residence in Sutton Place overlooking the East River, it was little dreamed that within so short a time such a marked migration from mid-Manhattan to the East River District would occur as is now in full swing. The article went on to describe how an unbroken line of new apartment buildings now lined 57th Street almost solidly from 2nd Avenue to Sutton Place. Developers had recognized that proximity to the neighborhood where Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Marbury lived created value. They built luxury apartment houses designed for wealthy tenants who wanted the prestige of a Sutton Place address. Where factories had once stood, elegant buildings rose. Where slaughterhouses had operated, landscaped courtyards appeared. The Times concluded that those who doubted the wisdom of Mrs. Vanderbilt's move have found a convincing answer to their conjectures as to the ultimate success of the Sutton Place movement. Within 8 years, Anne had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. She had proven that a squalid industrial neighborhood could become one of Manhattan's most fashionable addresses if women of vision and means chose to live there. She had demonstrated that real estate value was not fixed, but could be created through strategic decisions about where to invest and how to present a neighborhood to the rest of society. The mockery had turned to admiration. Society women who had questioned Anne's judgment in 1921 were now trying to buy properties in the neighborhood she had made desirable. The Sutton Place name, which had meant nothing in 1920, carried cachet by the end of the decade, and Mott Schmidt's career was launched. The Sutton Place houses became his calling card, proof that he could design in the Georgian style with sophistication and restraint that wealthy clients appreciated. He would go on to design dozens of houses for New York's elite, but Sutton Place remained the work that established his reputation. But Anne had already left the neighborhood she created. In 1927, just 6 years after moving to Sutton Place, she relocated to a triplex apartment on Park Avenue. She had accomplished what she set out to do. The neighborhood was established. Property values had increased. The experiment was complete. Anne could move on. Her final years divided between her Park Avenue residence and the house at 10 Rue LaRue in Paris that she had maintained from her time as Mrs. Vanderbilt. She lived with her longtime companions, Anne Morgan and Elizabeth Marbury, maintaining the relationships that had sustained her through 3 widowhoods, the deaths of both her sons, and the complicated negotiations with executors and heirs that accompanied each estate settlement. She continued her philanthropic work quietly, serving on boards, contributing to causes, and maintaining the social connections that had defined her adult life. She traveled between New York and Paris with the ease of someone who belonged equally to both cities and fully to neither. On April 20th, 1940, Anne Harriman Vanderbilt died in Manhattan. She was 79 years old. She had outlived her father and mother, all 3 of her husbands, and both of her sons from her first marriage. She had outlived most of her siblings and most of her generation. Her daughters from her second marriage survived her, but even the historical record on their later lives is sparse. The Gilded Age world in which Anne had been raised and in which she had moved for 8 decades was disappearing, replaced by a 20th century that had different values and different priorities. Anne's body was cremated. Her ashes were kept at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Manhattan from 1940 until 1976, held in temporary storage waiting for some final decision about permanent placement. In 1976, 36 years after her death, the ashes were finally moved to the Vanderbilt family mausoleum at Moravian Cemetery on Staten Island. The mausoleum had been designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had designed so many Vanderbilt properties and constructed between 1885 and 1886. Hunt had modeled it after a Romanesque church in Arles, France, creating a small chapel-like structure with rounded arches and thick stone walls. The landscaped grounds around the mausoleum had been designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had created Central Park and dozens of other significant American parks and estates. The Vanderbilt family section of Moravian Cemetery was private, closed to public access, reserved for family members, and accessible only by permission. Anne's remains joined William's in the family vault. In death, she finally achieved what she had not always had in life: permanent placement in a location that could not be taken away by executors or transferred to new owners. She rests there still, in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum, separated by decades and miles from the unknown location of her son Samuel's ashes, but finally at peace in a place that cannot be sold or subdivided or claimed by others. The mansion at 665th Avenue lasted exactly 6 years after Anne sold it to the Empire Trust Company in November of 1920. The company held the property, perhaps using some of the rooms for offices or entertaining important clients, perhaps simply holding it as an investment while they decided what to do with such a prominent location. In 1926, they made their decision. The mansion was demolished. Workers arrived with sledgehammers and crowbars to begin the destruction of what had been one of New York's most famous houses. They stripped the interiors first, removing anything valuable enough to salvage and sell. Marble mantels went to architectural salvage dealers. Carved wood paneling was pried from walls and sold to other wealthy families who wanted the prestige of Vanderbilt materials in their own homes. The exterior came down more brutally. Richard Morris Hunt's carefully carved limestone facade, with its gargoyles and medallions and Renaissance details, was broken into rubble. Stones that had been shaped by master craftsmen were loaded onto trucks and dumped as fill or crushed for aggregate. The French Renaissance chateau that Hunt had designed to announce Vanderbilt wealth, and that had served as Alva's launching pad into society, became dust and broken stone. An office building rose in its place, a commercial structure designed for maximum rentable square footage rather than beauty or permanence. Today, the site is indistinguishable from the other buildings around it. No plaque marks where the Petit Chateau stood. Most people walking past have no idea that one of the Gilded Age's most famous mansions once occupied that corner, the building that defined William K. Vanderbilt's presence in New York exists now only in photographs and architectural drawings. Idle Hour fell into a long, slow decline that stretched across nearly a century and continues even today. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt inherited the property in 1920, but found it difficult to sell. Operating a 900-acre estate with a 110-room mansion required enormous staff and constant maintenance. The annual costs ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Harold had his own life, his own interests in yachting and bridge and railroad management. He did not need or want to maintain his father's Long Island estate. In 1921, a syndicate headed by Frank Elbridge Webb agreed to purchase the estate for conversion into a country club. The plan was to turn the mansion into a clubhouse, develop golf courses on some of the acreage, and create a destination for wealthy Long Islanders who wanted recreational facilities without traveling far from New York. Webb's syndicate made an initial payment, but then fell behind on the installment schedule. By 1923, the deal had collapsed. The property reverted to Harold's ownership. During Prohibition, parts of the estate reportedly served Dutch Schultz, the gangster and bootlegger, as a hideout. Whether Schultz actually owned any portion of the property or simply used it with someone's permission or without anyone's knowledge is unclear in the fragment.